talking today about climate change adaptation planning. Of course, climate adaptation planning is seeking to adjust human environmental systems. It's an extremely new field. It really started only somewhere around 10, 15 years ago. And we wanted to focus on my colleague, Charlotte Daconher from UBSQ, who is my co-author in a number of publications that I'm going to cite today. And we really were very excited to compare the US and France, because in many ways, those countries have really drastically different approaches to land use planning and urban planning in general, and climate adaptation planning is not an exception. So France was the first country in the EU who actually made climate adaptation and climate action planning mandatory. Here in the US, we still don't have any federal policy on climate adaptation planning. It's probably even not relevant for the US because it's such a large country. So it's very much under the jurisdictions of states, but most of the time, cities are really developing their climate adaptation plans on their own, and it's very much bottom up. So French approach is very top down, the US approach in general, very bottom up. We really wanted to see what's the best of both worlds and see what kind of lessons we can learn from comparing those experiences. We were particularly interested in how consideration of equity in climate adaptation planning is linked, first of all, to how cities perceive what is their vulnerability to climate change, how they address diversity and inclusion of stakeholders who are actually involved in vulnerability assessment and in climate adaptation planning. So we are going to start with three hypotheses. So our first hypothesis was that consideration of equity in climate adaptation goals is related to the way how cities think about their vulnerability. Our second hypothesis was that the scope of vulnerability assessment and the choice of the methodology is related to the inclusion of diverse groups of stakeholders. The third hypothesis was that the consideration of equity in climate adaptation planning goals is related to the inclusion of diverse groups of stakeholders involved in climate adaptation planning. Now, I want to emphasize that those are multi-issue climate adaptation plans. They all identify impacts relevant for their area. One, I think that is important, our study in general, not just specifically with regard to France and the US. It's important for cities to have some kind of platform, some kind of common language, and be able to compare their efforts based on comparable criteria. So here is the conceptual model for this study. We are looking essentially at three areas. First of all, on how cities are thinking about their vulnerability. Then we are also looking at the diversity of different groups of stakeholders that are involved in climate adaptation planning. And then we are examining climate adaptation goals set in the plans along these 12 domains, such as green infrastructure, housing, and energy security and transportation, and so on. And we are exploring how equity is addressed in each of those. There is a little bit of kind of growing rift between climate adaptation and risk assessment communities over the past 10 years. Do we really see it as exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity all being part of vulnerability, or as more recent reports by the IPCC suggest, we really probably should look at exposure as something more external to the system. In my 2020 paper, I actually introduced the concept of perceived vulnerability that I prefer to differentiate from this more classical vulnerability used in climate adaptation studies, because the way how we think about vulnerability, the way how cities, communities think about vulnerability is always subjective. Now, a few more definitions before we move to the analysis. Equity is a social concept. It can be defined as a state or the quality or ideal of being just. Justice is a legal term that essentially has very close meaning. Climate justice is really, really important as it offers a human rights perspective on the climate crisis, and it acknowledges that climate change has very different impacts and very different vulnerabilities. Kind of built-in block in this conceptual framework is, of course, our focus on diversity and inclusion. Here, we're trying to capture diversity and inclusion in vulnerability assessment, and especially in the climate adaptation planning process. And it's extremely difficult to capture all the demographic and socioeconomic variables really to fully understand and capture diversity and inclusion of stakeholders because most of this data is never collected.